that time of year, Alaskans are looking in their freezers and saying, it's almost summertime, time for that summer harvest, but what am I going to do with all this fish that I haven't used yet? Well, thank goodness, canning could be your answer. I'm here today to tell you about how to safely go from the freezer to a jar. Hi, I'm Linda Tannehill, Kenai Peninsula Health Home and Family Development Agent. Start with reliable information. We consider resource-based information the best way to go, especially when we're working with low-acid foods such as salmon. We have publications. This particular one I'm going to be featuring today is Canning the Fish Catch. And this one is how to can fish with pints and half-pint jars. And then we also have a publication on how to can fish in quart jars if you're needing larger amounts. Another resource that we recommend is this guide from University of Georgia. It's so easy to preserve, and this is all the food preservation methods, not just canning. Next, it's important to have a pressure canner. Not just important, it's critical, because a pressure canner heats the interior of the contents in the jars up to 240 degrees, which is critical for salmon because we're trying to destroy the bacteria spores that cause botulism. There are several types of canners. There are dial gauge canners such as this one. So if you have a canner that has a dial, this needs to be checked prior to use at the extension office. There are also weighted gauge canners such as this one, where there is no dial, it's a weight. There's nothing to check on this as far as accuracy for the gauge, but be sure to check to make sure all the parts are there. You need the gasket, you need a rack in the bottom, and then another rack if you're going to do 2 layers in your canner. Also, before ever using a canner, if there's a vent port, make sure that you look through it to make sure you can see daylight so that nothing is clogged in that hole. Other equipment you'll use, of course, are jars. As I mentioned, we have publications on how to can in half pints, pints, and quart jars. You'll also need a 2-piece sealing lid. You have the flat part and you have the screw band. You'll notice on the instructions that you no longer need to heat treat these. It says wash in hot soapy water, rinse, and set aside until you use them. So just know that that's one less pan that you have to have on the stove. Other things that you'll need, a nice cutting board. I try to devote just one cutting board to fish so that I don't have to worry about cross-contamination. I like having a fillet knife to skin the fish and a nice solid knife to cut the fish pieces. You'll need a jar lifter, and the only use for this jar lifter is to take the hot jars out of the canner and without breaking the seal on the jar. You could try to improvise on this, but it's just better to go and purchase one of these. Another thing, a Sharpie, because if you're, let's say, canning different additives to your fish, whether it's salt or no salt or other flavorings, you can write with the Sharpie on the flat lid prior to canning, and it will withstand the canning process. Speaking of salt and other additives, one of the things people often ask is, do I have to add salt? Salt is just a flavoring agent. It has nothing to do with the preservation of the fish. We encourage people to use a pure salt, such as this canning and pickling salt, because other salts have impurities in them that can turn the fish off colors. Something else is a timer of some kind. Nowadays, a lot of people use their cell phones because they have a timer on it. There's timers on your stoves for some people. And the old school way is to sit down and write the start time, add 100 minutes, and then write the end time so that you can check your math. there's several ways to do that. Also have a towel, a dry towel, so that when the fish does come out of the canner, you have a place to set those hot jars, because you don't want to set them on a surface such as this Formica, because the jars could break. Not this time, but maybe the next time that they are under pressure. Another thing to have is some kind of plastic or wooden or something that isn't metal to put in the jar to align the product once that you have it in the jar, because metal, if I were to use this metal spoon, it can put nicks in the jar, and then maybe next time under pressure the jar would crack. So one of the things that you're going to need for sure is your fish. Don't forget the fish. Because we're working from taking it out of the freezer, you have to thaw the fish completely. That is, thaw it safely in the refrigerator or under cool running water. If you have a lot of fish to process, make sure that you allow yourself enough time to get that fish thawed. Once it's thawed, you'll have to look for freezer burn if it's been in there very long, and just check for that, because canning does not help the flavor of freezer burn, and neither does smoking. So those pieces will need to be discarded for human consumption. We do have a publication on adding variety to home canned fish. It's not required. Some people like to add flavorings to their fish, and but this one is less scientific, and it talks more about good flavor, acceptable flavor, and poor flavor. So these were things that people found not to be very palatable. As I mentioned earlier, since we're working with frozen fish, it's really important to thaw the fish safely in the refrigerator or under cool running water. Also, once the fish is thawed, check it for freezer burn and make sure that there's no freezer burn on it. Now, my fish was frozen, assuming I would either can it with the skin off or that I would have eaten this by now. So I did not take the scales off of the fish. If at this point you plan to keep the skin on the fish, it's important to scale it, even these small pieces. And of course, you can feel which way to scale it by running your thumbnail along here. Something as simple as the back of a spoon can be used to scale this fish. The reason you want to scale the fish is because these small scales can loosen during the process and get up under here, because these jars are self-exhausting. So with this flat lid on here, the contents could come out and a piece of scale could get caught right there and ruin the seal. And a lot of people don't know why their jars don't seal. That could be one reason. So for myself, I have chosen not to use the skin. Now I have a jar started here, and the way I like to do it is this canner will take 8 pint jars. So I like to have my 8 jars open, and unless I have a helper, if I'm doing this by myself, I have all 8 jars open until the very end, because you might be able to see there's still a little bit of room in this jar for some salmon. And so I like to pack the jars as full as possible, but you do have to leave the 1 inch head space. So I like to use the jar as a guide on what the size will be. And for myself, when I am taking the skin off, I need to move it toward the end of the table. Just because of the type of knife I have, I find if I move the cutting board toward the end of the table, I can fillet the skin off easier. And so it's just a little motion of removing that skin. Now, using the jar as a guide, I like to cut. Now, some people have been canning fish so long, they can eyeball it. So don't feel like you have to measure if you're one of those people that you have been doing it your entire life. So then, put it in. There's an inch of headspace, and then I add the rest of the fish. And I always have another piece ready to go to fill the other jars. And then this, I just start. You don't have to shove it in, but just try and get as much in as possible. You can see there's still an inch of headspace, and this jar could use a little bit more. And I like some of these thin pieces to use to complete the task. So, as I was mentioning, something plastic to align the product and remove as much air as possible. Because this is a messy project, have a dampened paper towel and clean the rims. This is a good time to double check to make sure that there's no nicks in the jar. If you've already done that, that's great, but just in case something has happened along the way with the process, if there's a nick in the jar, there's a good chance it won't seal. So I cleaned the rim. This is the flat lid that has been washed, rinsed, and set aside. Put it on, take the screw band, and what I do is just wait until it catches and then go about an inch. And that's fingertip tightening, that's what they call it. So it's not putting your whole wrist down on there, because you can tighten it so much that this flat lid will buckle into a little upward V, and then again a sealing failure. So again, fingertip tighten. So you would do that for all 8 jars, or however many. For example, you could put 16 half-pint jars in this canner. So in this canner, just keep in mind to keep your jars longer. Try not to stress them by having hot water in the canner. You're trying to keep the product, which is the fish, the jar, and the water in the canner about the same temperature. So you have 40-degree fish because it has been in the refrigerator. You have a room temperature jar, which in my house is about 65, and then room temperature water in the canner. So don't try to hurry the process by heating up the water, because it might not happen this time, but next time, if you've ever had a jar that the bottom fell out, that's called thermal shock, and that is a result of going from hot to cold. So have 3 inches of water in your canner, and yes, you can use a ruler, but I used a ruler once and I measured my finger so that I could see to here is 3 inches of water. So I always put this under the faucet, cool running water, 3 inches of water, and then the rack. And you don't need to use the jar lifter because this is a raw pack. So the jar is cold, and you'll put it in the canner. If you have 2 to 3 inches of water in the canner, chances are the water in the canner, once you get all your jars in here, will be coming up to about here. And that's okay, because you fingertip tighten. The water isn't going to get in, but the jar is going to be able to exhaust. Now that all the jars are in the canner, it's time to put the lid on. As I mentioned, though, always look through the vent port to make sure that you can see daylight through it, because if it's clogged, that's where human error comes into the problem with canning. So put the lid on, leave the gauge off, and put it on your heat source. Some people use a propane burner outside, some people are using their range in their house. So turn the heat up on high, and this is where your timer comes in handy. And you'll wait for the steam to start coming through here. On this particular canner, it's in the shape of a V. So it's fully steaming when you see the V. Also, this raises and locks the canner lid in place. So once this V starts, you'll time 10 minutes. What you're trying to do is remove any trapped air in the canner, because that can decrease any trapped air can decrease the temperature in the canner, which would lead to underprocessing your fish, which is a foodborne illness issue. So you wait 10 minutes for that to vent, then put the weight on. On a dial gauge canner, you would vent, and then you would either close the petcock or put the dead weight on. There are different styles, but follow your manufacturer's instructions on how to use your canner. So on this particular canner, this weight rocks. So I wait for it to start to rock, and once it starts to rock, I turn the heat back just a little bit, because that's on very high heat. This one is just supposed to rock gently. If I leave the heat on too high, it's going to go like this, and it's not supposed to do that. It's supposed to rock gently. So once it starts rocking, that's when I start the timer. So 100 minutes is an hour and 40 minutes. So if you're writing it down, remember that's 60 minutes plus 40 minutes, or setting your timer. So once you've completed the 100 minutes, if possible, move it off of the heat source, especially if you have an electric range, because it will continue to heat. It just takes longer and it's over processed. So just move it off of the heat source and wait for the pressure to drop. On this particular one, this will drop, and I can flick this, and if I don't hear any pressure, it's safe to take this off. I probably would use a pot holder. This might be very, very hot. So take that off and wait a few minutes, and then open the lid and be very careful. Always lift the lid away from you. If you've canned at all, you know that steam is coming up out of that canner. So put the lid to the side. And some of the jar companies encourage you to wait 10 minutes. So you might want to wait 10 minutes for this, and you'll start to hear them popping. So the popping sound is that they are starting to seal, because they went from very hot to cooling off. So now, here comes your jar lifter. So these jars are very hot. Lift it straight out and over to a surface that is not on a cold surface. So I have this towel, and allow that to cool for 12 hours. After 12 hours, you can check it to make sure that it is absolutely sealed. If it sounds like this, it's not sealed. So you have this sealed jar, you wait 12 hours, and then take the ring off. Don't store your fish with a ring on, because these corrode very easily, and they can corrode so much that it will break the seal. So this jar is sealed. You have your Sharpie, if you didn't already write on the top. I have Sockeye 2021 on here. So that one is ready to go. What I would like to encourage you to do, I was talking earlier about using plastic to align the product. I encourage you, when you get your picnic pack or whatever it is, your plastic forks, save one for getting the contents out of a jar, because it's the same process. When you stick, let's say, a metal spoon in there, it can cause those micro nicks on the jar, and under pressure next time it may break. So use plastic or wood if you can, to get the contents out of the jar. Now, we did raw fish. We also have a publication on canning smoked fish. And I just want to call your attention to, when you can smoked fish, you do a light smoke because canning intensifies the smoked flavor. And then the processing time is 110 minutes, not 100 minutes, 110 minutes. Try to use this product within a year. And so what you've done now is you've taken the fish from the freezer that you got last summer, you've canned it, and now you have a year to use this product. Have a great summer.